Hello, my name is Dr. Calynn Lawrence, and I am the founder of the Holistic Healing Source for Marginalized Society. And today I am going to be redefending my Master of Science in Criminal Justice and Public Administration research capstone so that we can add this to our research repository. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Get started. It's taking a little bit to get loaded. Sorry about that. Why true justice is literally skin deep in the USA, a supposed human right that our legal system withholds from BIPOC populations. Originally taught by myself, Dr. Calynn Lawrence. Learn more at www.holistichealingsource.org. The concept of the American dream is frequently associated with lofty ideals of freedom, opportunity, and equality, suggesting a society where all citizens stand equal before the law. However, the historical and contemporary reality of the United States legal system demonstrates a profound departure from this creed, particularly for Black, Indigenous, and people of color, or BIPOC. From the nation's founding, which relied on the rape and pillaging of the indigenous population alongside the robbery of and policing of Black lives, racism was deeply embedded within the legal framework, framing human bondage as a matter of law and order while criminalizing minority literacy and self determination. Following the Civil War, the ratification of the 13th Amendment abolished slavery but explicitly preserved it as a punishment for a crime, paving the way for Black codes that effectively criminalized everyday behaviors for African Americans and fueled the convict lease system. This historical foundation set a precedent where state violence and extrajudicial terrorism, such as lynch mobs, upheld racial hierarchies and severely restricted educational and economic opportunities for marginalized groups that still exist today. Throughout the 20th century, the relationship between race and the criminal justice system was further solidified through federal and state policies that prioritized punitive law enforcement over social development and community welfare. Following the urban uprisings of the 1960s, policies such as the Law Enforcement Assistance Act catalyzed a massive influx of federal funding for local police forces, increasing allocations exponentially and intertwining law enforcement intimately with the suppression of civil rights movements. This era established a framework where political rhetoric explicitly associated Black and Brown communities with crime and drug use as a mechanism to disrupt these communities and vilify them publicly, laying the groundwork for a systemic shift towards carceral solutions. Consequently, the justice system became a mechanism for social control rather than genuine public safety, disproportionately targeting neighborhoods of color. The subsequent war on drugs, initiated in earnest during the 1980s and further escalated in the 1990s, exponentially increased physical incarceration under the guise of crime control. Between 1980 and 2000, the United States added approximately 1.1 million inmates to its prison systems, an unprecedented expansion driven not by an increase in violent crime, but by a targeted policy and policy choices surrounding drug enforcement. Thanks, Reagan. Obviously, sarcastically. Aggressive policing strategies, such as those inspired by the broken windows theory, heavily penalized minor infractions in minority neighborhoods, pulling millions of BIPOC individuals into the criminal justice apparatus for low level offenses. These policies effectively reforged the historically troubled link between race and the legal system, transforming individual punishment into the mass incarceration of entire demographic groups. In modern times, the legacy of these policies manifests in phenomena such as the school to prison pipeline, where exclusionary disciplinary practices disproportionately funnel Black and Brown youth away from the educational settings and into juvenile and adult correctional facilities. Data from the U.S. Department of Education highlights this systemic bias, revealing that Black and Latino students are consistently punished more severely than white students for the same exact infractions. For example, Black and Latino students are suspended or expelled 3 times more than their white peers for the same offenses, sometimes even less. Furthermore, these marginalized students are subjected to harsher discipline while being provided with significantly fewer academic resources, as their predominantly non-white school districts receive an average of $2,226 less per pupil, per student, in educational funding compared to majority white school districts. This vastly impacts the school's ability to have sufficient staff ratios, classroom supplies, books, technology, enriching activities, and holistic support programs in place for the overall well-being of students, when many low-income BIPOC students have higher needs for these things in the first place than their white counterparts, yet they are punished more severely and extremely under-resourced in comparison. Entrenched punitive mechanisms, funding prison construction, and supporting the characterization or treatment of marginalized youth as quote unquote super predators rather than children in need were exacerbated by the 1994 Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which falsely justified the militarization of school environments. Educational enclosures and the intense policing of public schools frequently prioritize security over intellectual development, transforming schools into environments that mimic carceral states and enforce early criminalization. The normalization of these tactics is directly a reflection of a broader societal willingness to utilize the criminal justice system to manage quote unquote marginalized populations. The systemic history of police violence and brutality also remains a defining feature of the relationship between race and the justice system, deeply impacting community trust. Egregious instances of brutality, such as the shootings and subsequent cover-ups by police following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, demonstrate how the lethal intersection of systemic racism and unchecked authority operates in crisis scenarios. Such incidents highlight a code of silence among law enforcement that historically protects officers from accountability when force is deployed disproportionately against BIPOC individuals. These systemic, historical, and contemporary events unequivocally demonstrate that the relationship between race and the criminal justice system is not a byproduct of objective law enforcement, but rather the result of a deliberately designed, racialized policy regime. We need to address racial disparities in the criminal justice system. A rigorous evaluation of current empirical data definitively shows that the criminal justice system must aggressively address severe racial disparities, as these imbalances compromise the fundamental legitimacy of the state and perpetuate cycles of harm. The statistics surrounding mass incarceration highlight a deeply entrenched crisis where BIPOC individuals are overrepresented at every stage of the justice process, a reality that demands immediate systemic intervention. For example, research into recidivism reveals that race is a significant predictor of continued justice involvement. An analysis of men who had gone through the juvenile system in Sao Paulo found that being Black was explicitly linked to higher chances of subsequent adult criminal prosecution, indicating the presence of structural racism that transcends borders, meaning it is not just in the US. This is a worldwide thing. When the justice system routinely produces harsher outcomes for individuals based on their race rather than their conduct, the system fails its foundational mandate of equal protection. At the institutional level, racial disparities are continuously perpetuated by the ways state, county, and city governments allocate their fiscal resources, prioritizing the punishment of minorities over their social welfare. Research into how local and state governments distribute their annual budgets demonstrates a strong link between a region's racial demographics and its financial priorities. When cities and states have larger Black and Brown populations, they tend to funnel more money into the criminal justice system, including prisons, police, and courts, while simultaneously cutting the funding for social safety nets like healthcare and housing initiatives. This shift in funding indicates that the governments often react to increasing minority demographics by bolstering punitive systems instead of investing in community support, underscoring the urgent need to confront how systemic racism is embedded within institutional budgeting. Furthermore, the criminal justice system must address racial disparities because they are intimately linked and inherently linked with severe public health failures, particularly regarding how systems interface with behavioral health issues across different racial groups. For Latinos and African Americans suffering from behavioral health disorders, contact with the justice system frequently precedes access to mental health treatment, resulting in prolonged delays between system contact, symptom onset, and clinical care. Because systemic barriers, such as punitive drug policies and lack of community resources, restrict access to proactive care, individuals from marginalized backgrounds are disproportionately funneled into the justice system rather than receiving the therapeutic interventions that they need. Addressing this disparity is vital because treating medical and psychological crises with incarceration rather than healthcare exacerbates trauma and guarantees high recidivism rates. The psychological toll of this system targeting is severe, as Latino and African American men who have a history with the criminal justice system suffer from unacceptable rates of untreated or undertreated trauma and adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs. The structural trauma of racism, poverty, and justice involvement frequently results in insecure adult attachment styles and substance use disorders, making these populations highly vulnerable to cyclical incarceration. Then, the failure to provide mental health treatment during incarceration or upon reentry demonstrates a critical need to reform the system. Treating traumatized BIPOC populations with punishment rather than clinical care ignores the root causes of their behavior. Therefore, addressing racial disparities requires integrating culturally responsive mental health interventions into the justice framework to stop this cycle of harm. Post-release data further solidifies the need for structural change, as individuals re-entering society are structurally abandoned to fail. A population-based retrospective data linkage study revealed that former inmates have drastically higher rates of contact with emergency health services for substance use and psychological crises than the general population. The adjusted incidence rate ratios for emergency department contacts and ambulance uses highlight a catastrophic failure in transitional care, disproportionately impacting marginalized groups. If the criminal justice system does not address the racialized nature of this abandonment, it will continue to perpetuate a cycle where BIPOC individuals are released without support, only to be rearrested when their untreated health needs manifest as public order issues. Importantly, while systemic bias is pervasive on a macro level, its manifestation in highly specific micro level procedural environments highlights the complexity of the issue and the need for comprehensive reform. For instance, a recent meta-analysis evaluating the effects of race on forensic science decision making found a pooled odds ratio indicating a statistically trivial direct effect of race on adverse outcomes within isolated forensic examinations. However, the researchers explicitly warned that this negligible finding in a specific scientific domain does not negate the existence of systemic bias across the broader criminal justice continuum, advocating for continued scrutiny of all justice processes. That is why I am a proponent of legal system reform, not just criminal justice reform. The entire legal system has got to be worked on. Ultimately, addressing racial disparities across every facet of the system is not optional. Failing to correct disproportionate enforcement rates will continue to fracture communities of color and perpetuate the economic destabilization of BIPOC neighborhoods. Let us analyze the social justice and ethics flaws associated with race in the system. An unmitigated ethical crisis. The profound racial disparities in the criminal justice system create severe ethical crises, most notably fracturing the institutional legitimacy of law enforcement and the courts in the eyes of BIPOC citizens. National survey data indicates that an overwhelming 89% of Blacks believe the criminal justice system is biased against them, compared to only 38% of whites. Similarly, 66% of Blacks asserted that Black communities have unfair levels of drug law enforcement, a view shared only by 21% of whites. This stark divergence in perception breeds deep legal cynicism, leading to social consequences such as an unwillingness to trust police responsiveness or cooperate with investigations. Ethically, a justice system that is perceived by a massive portion of its citizenry as unfair by design cannot claim democratic legitimacy. This illegitimacy is evidenced by the fact that 69% of Black respondents expressed a willingness to engage in jury nullification when an arresting officer is accused of racial bias. The ethical principles meant to guide criminal justice practitioners, such as impartiality, fairness, and the protection of public trust, are severely compromised by these realities. Under foundational executive branch ethical standards, public trust is a rudimentary component of public service, requiring employees to strive for impartiality and diligently fight the urge for preferential treatment to any group, including ones that they identify with. However, normative ethics dictates that when cultural and systemic practices, such as the code of silence or routine racial profiling, continuously violate these standards, the system itself becomes morally culpable. The ethical dilemma of balancing absolute moral rules against culturally relative enforcement practices underscores that the justice system currently fails the basic test of ethical absolutism, that all individuals deserve equal dignity and protection under the law. Furthermore, the intersectionality of race, gender, class, and mental illness compounds the ethical violations inherent in the current system, requiring an intersectional lens to fully grasp the scope of the injustice. Traditional criminal justice models frequently ignore the systemic victimization of marginalized groups prior to their incarceration, punishing them for survival behaviors linked to systemic neglect. Advancing equity at this intersection requires acknowledging that the system disproportionately punishes those who are already disenfranchised by poverty and untreated mental illness and other factors. An ethics of care approach must be prioritized to replace pure retributive justice, emphasizing restorative practices that acknowledges the vulnerability of individuals entangled in the system. Additionally, incorporating the narrative framework of psychological jurisprudence, which advocates for virtue ethics as criminal justice practice, can radically reform how the system views the ontology of offending, pushing practitioners towards therapeutic rather than purely punitive responses. A system that ignores the trauma and vulnerability of unknowing victims and marginalized defendants alike is ethically bankrupt and actively perpetuates social inequality. The moral necessity of federal government intervention and reform. Given the sheer scale of racial disparities and the historical complicity of federal policies in creating mass incarceration, the federal government must take an active, aggressive role in rectifying these injustices across all criminal justice agencies. Historically, the federal government fueled the expansion of the carceral state through initiatives like the Safe Streets Act and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which mandated harsh sentencing, incentivizing prison construction, and funded the militarization of local police forces. Because federal legislation and funding formulas created the architecture of racialized mass imprisonment, it is ethical, and practical as responsibility of the federal government to dismantle it by utilizing its power of the purse to force reform. The federal government should condition law enforcement grants and state funding on the explicit reduction of racial disparities in arrests, sentencing, and incarceration rates, actively reversing the incentives that previously drove the draconian war on drugs. A critical area for federal intervention involves dismantling the aggressive street level enforcement tactics that disproportionately target minority neighborhoods, such as the broken windows policing strategy. The federal government can utilize its regulatory powers and the Department of Justice oversight, for example, consent decrees, to mandate that local and state governments cease implementing discriminatory policing models, which frequently escalate minor infractions into violent, racially biased encounters. Furthermore, the federal government and their oversight must be utilized to halt the school to prison pipeline by fundamentally restructuring how public education and juvenile justice are funded at the national levels. Congress must prohibit the deployment of police in public schools, redirecting those federal funds toward counselors, mental health professionals, and robust educational curricula that honor BIPOC history rather than criminalizing minority youth. Federal involvement is equally desperately needed to bridge the profound gap between behavioral health services and the criminal justice system to ensure that BIPOC populations receive care rather than cages. The federal government should aggressively mandate and fund crisis intervention team models and training across all local police departments, as research demonstrates that such training enhances officer knowledge, it alters attitudes, and builds the self-efficacy required to safely de-escalate mental health emergencies. While psychosis drastically increases the likelihood of an involuntary psychiatric hold during a police encounter, standardized federal guidelines for CIT could ensure that these vulnerable individuals are diverted to clinical care rather than jail. Beyond initial police contact, the federal government must subsidize multidisciplinary co-responder frameworks, such as the embedded police social worker model. Providing federal grants for agencies to employ PSWs ensures that individuals in crisis receive expert micro-level crisis intervention and macro-level resource delivery, effectively diverting high-needs populations away from the criminal justice system entirely. For those who are already incarcerated, federal policy must mandate tailored rehabilitation programs that account for specific socio-demographic and psychosocial needs, recognizing that treating substance-dependent individuals requires vastly different approaches than treating non-bias motivated or hate crime offenders. Finally, the federal government must fund structured reentry programs such as the Peer Engaged Empowered Recovery Program, or the PEER program, to assist substance-dependent inmates transitioning back into society. Leveraging peer support specialists can drastically mitigate the high rates of post-release emergency health contacts currently plaguing the system. Moreover, federal guidelines should encourage culturally competent rehabilitation models, such as those utilizing religious moderation and cultural frameworks to instill community commitment and deter narcotics abuse, ensuring that recovery aligns with the cultural identities of the BIPOC offenders. By comprehensively reallocating federal budgets away from punitive correctional facilities and toward holistic community-based public welfare programs, the federal government can address the root socioeconomic causes of crime and finally deliver the true justice and equal protection promised by the American dream. If there is no true justice for all of mankind, there shall be no peace for the oppressors. Thank you. Review my full literature review with sources alphabetized by name and summaries at the link here in this presentation, or at the link that is inside, if you are on the Holistic Healing Source website, the link that is inside of this article. Thank you.